Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar today. Thanks to all of you for joining us. I'll just introduce myself first. I'm Bronwyn Smith-Thomas. I'm Head of Campaigns and Politics at the Climate Coalition. We're here today to discuss the findings of a new report called Sustaining the Political Mandate for Climate Action. I've even got a copy here. There should be a link to this in the chat as well if you want to go and read the findings in more detail afterwards. So this report's really incredibly timely. As we're heading into an election year, we're all aware that the politics of climate change is becoming ever more contested. And it's really important for us to understand more about how politicians engage with and relate with this subject, and also how they engage and relate to those of us working on it. So that's the focus for today's webinar. Before I hand over to our speakers, just to let you know how we're going to run things, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function on your screen. And you can also there upvote any questions other people have asked that you're particularly interested in. I'm not necessarily going to be able to keep track of the chat as well, so please use the Q&A for questions. And then after we've heard from our speakers, we will endeavour to get through as many of those as we can. So I'm really pleased to be able to introduce our two speakers today. We have with us the academics who led on this research, Professor Becky Willis and Dr. Steve Westlake from Lancaster University. And I'm going to first hand to Steve to kick us off. Over to you, Steve.
Great. Many thanks, Bronwyn. I'm just going to share my screen and just sharing that now. So hopefully you'll be able to see the screen. Can you just confirm that that slide's showing okay, please? Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks very much, Bronwyn. It's a real pleasure to be presenting this report. The report has been produced in coalition with Green Alliance and the Climate Coalition, with funding from the CAST Centre, the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations. And I've been working with Becky Willis from Lancaster University as part of the Climate Citizens project. So yeah, we're delighted to be presenting this research. It actually updates previous research which Becky did over a period of time. A report came out in 2018 called Maintaining the Political Mandate for Climate Action. Some of you may be familiar with that report. Had quite a lot of impact. And so this one is in effect updating that. Lots has changed in the last 5 years. So this one's called Sustaining the Political Mandate for Climate Action. I'll just move on. So the research is based on interviews with MPs. We did 15 interviews with MPs, and you can see some details of the MPs there. One of the key things was that we were asking them about their own experience of and perception of their climate mandate, but also where they thought their parliamentary colleagues were at. So the conversations, obviously the many conversations they have with people within their own party, within other parties, select committees, etc. So we feel that it's not just the experience of 15 MPs, there's a broader perspective of where the whole of Parliament is sitting on climate change and the various views. We also did a focus group with NGO staff to get their perspective. So these were staff who work with MPs, and to get their perspectives, and that helped us to confirm or even contradict some of the findings and just get a broader picture. So that's the basis of the research. And essentially, one of the key questions for the research was what has changed in 5 years? What's changed since that report that Becky produced in 2018? And one of the key findings, perhaps the headline finding, is that climate is now mainstream for MPs. They all say that it's a really important issue. They feel able to speak out on it, whereas previously Becky found that many MPs felt that climate was they could be depicted as being a bit of a freak or a zealot if they were advocating strongly for climate change. Now that's really changed, and most MPs want to speak out about it, or even if they're not very strong advocates, they feel the need to pay at least lip service to it. And Becky will talk a little bit about that in her slides in a few minutes. So MPs feel that a case can be made for climate action because the climate is visibly changing. We see wildfires, we see extreme events all around the world, and this confirms that it's actually happening. It's happening now. We need to take action. They also look to success stories within the UK. For instance, offshore wind was mentioned. The plummeting costs of offshore wind and renewables means that MPs can make a really strong economic case in spite of any other requirements to tackle climate change. They can just say this makes economic sense from an energy point of view. And they also said that they have an increased mandate from their constituents. So there was a range of views expressed about how on board and how committed their constituents were, how supportive they were of climate action. Some MPs said it's the number one issue, or at least the number one underlying issue for them. Some MPs said that their constituents weren't particularly interested in climate change, and that seems to be related to the affluence of the constituency. Becky will talk a little bit more about that. But generally, the mandate for constituents has really gone up as far as MPs are concerned. But the debate has shifted from the need for change to the pace of change and the type of change. And this is where we see some interesting divergence between MPs and perhaps some problems in the future, because there's essentially, our conclusion from the report is that the quiet consensus on climate change has probably come to an end, and we're seeing that perhaps play out in politics right now. And there's a danger of polarization. So I will hand over to Becky to talk in more detail about what the MPs actually said.
Thank you, Steve. So, do
you want me to put all of the bullet points up, or one by one?
Yes, sorry, I didn't realise. Okay. I didn't realise it. I didn't. Oh, hang on, we got the wrong one. I will. Bear with me. I'll see if I can share my screen.
Okay, I'll stop sharing.
It wouldn't be an event without some technical issues, so I'll share my screen. Great. So yeah, what we're going to present the results to you through giving you 3 pen portraits of 3 different MPs. Now, these aren't actual MPs. What we've done is to take 15 interviews and condense them into 3 what we call composite narratives. So it's 3 pen portraits that represent the spectrum of views on climate amongst MPs. They are real in that all quotes and views that we give you came directly from the interviewees. The only fiction is to sort of condense them into 3, partly because you don't want to go through 15 slides, but also so that way we can preserve their anonymity. So the first the person that we want to introduce you to is Arya, who is a relatively young MP and very vocal about climate and quite optimistic. She says that climate's on the agenda now in a way that it wasn't before, but she does worry when she looks at her colleagues that people are just sort of paying lip service. They know that they have to talk about it, but there's no depth to it. So for that reason, she thinks it's really important, and she really appreciates senior level support, particularly from party leaders. And she says without that, it's very hard for less senior MPs to speak up. Although she sees climate as sort of part of the political debate now, she makes the point that it's still not where it needs to be given the scale of the crisis. She represents a less affluent constituency, and she says that for a lot of her constituents, there are more pressing things to think about, like putting food on the table. And she says that it's not necessarily front of mind for them. Although she also said that that in amongst her more affluent constituents, and she saw this with her colleagues as well, often it was sort of better off, more well-educated people who are forming some of the opposition, for example, against renewables developments, because they have the resources and the motivation to mobilise. So it's quite a complex picture about how socioeconomic background links to people taking action or speaking out for or against climate. And lastly, on the sort of, in terms of the politicization of climate, what worries Arya is that the sort of the more negative voices on climate make it a difficult issue to speak about, because you're throwing yourself into that controversy. And she worries that for some MPs, this makes it sort of too dangerous to mention because you're dragged into that debate. So it sort of ups the stakes for being involved in climate debates. Then the next character is Chris. He is older. He's relatively new to Parliament though, and he had a career in business beforehand. We've called him a technical transitioner because he is very committed to climate action and sees that particularly through the lens of leadership in net zero industries. So he's a little bit critical of the sort of some of what he sees as the more outspoken climate voices, because he thinks that the language around climate has become a bit hysterical. So he understands why there might be emotion, but he wants to centre on what he calls the duller evidence-based approach, and thinks that, you know, you need to make an economic case and we need to position the UK at the forefront of this transition. And as part of that, he's worried about alienating parts of industry. He sees, for example, oil companies like BP and Shell as being part of the solution, but also as being so crucial to our economy that we cannot sort of discount or overrule them. That they might have a role in some of the crucial industries like hydrogen and carbon capture, and so he doesn't like outright opposition to industry in any sense at all. So he's, you know, quite sort of pragmatic and very economically focused, but still sees himself as a climate champion. And then lastly, we have Alan, who's at best you could describe as an ambivalent supporter. So, you know, it's hard not to think of what MPs like Arya think about, say about lip service, because, you know, Alan says, I accept that something has to be done, but I don't have the bandwidth. You know, I'm thinking about so much that really I don't have the time to pay detailed attention to climate. So when he talks about where he gets his evidence from, he says that he does listen to both sides and that he's open-minded. So what this means is that he is wanting to see what he sees as both sides of the debate around questions like, you know, the need to, as he might put it, balance swift carbon reduction with the need for energy security. Or, you know, he would be someone who's likely to bring up the fact that the UK is only, you know, a small percentage of global emissions and wants other countries to play their part. These are arguments that you'd expect someone like Alan to make. In terms of the his constituents' views, he's relatively dismissive of that. He doesn't see it as something that is sort of front of mind for constituents. And Steve will go on to say something to the extent to which these views are, you know, not congruent with polling evidence. But the fact is that, you know, Alan doesn't see big benefits electorally or in terms of constituency popularity in championing climate. And he thinks that the consensus is, you know, less secure than it may appear on the surface, because people don't want to raise a sceptical voice either about the science or about potential action in public fora. But those conversations do happen in Parliament. As he puts it, if you go into the tea room or the bar, there's more of a private concern. And I think he feels like there's a bit of self-censorship going on around that. So I'll stop sharing there and go back to Steve, who's going to pull together some common conclusions and start thinking about what that means for NGOs.
Yeah, thanks very much, Becky. I'll just start sharing my screen. So hopefully you can see the common themes that Becky just mentioned. So there were obviously some common themes and some differences that came out in those pen portraits. So while climate is mainstream and most MPs speak up about the need for action, they feel like they're walking a tightrope. So those who are very strong in terms of advocacy, even they feel like they're walking a tightrope to maintain the political mandate for policies that affect people's lives. So there's a clear sense that they think the political mandate is fragile, and constituents and the public as a whole, and perhaps the nation as a whole, could lose support for net zero targets if a lot of care isn't taken. Particularly when there are local impacts for constituents, things get political and issues of freedom and fairness come to the fore. And we saw that with the Willis scheme and the Uxbridge by-election, where an environmental policy or a policy that was significant for the environment became really pivotal and polarizing. And there's been an example in the last few weeks as well. The Cambridge congestion charge zone has been dropped after the political consensus fell apart. And this is indicative. Obviously, climate was part of the argument that was being made for that congestion charge zone, the need to improve air quality, but also to reduce emissions. But after a prolonged time of political toing and froing, that consensus fell apart and it's been scrapped for now. So we can see that these local impacts on the ground are where the political mandate is perhaps most vulnerable. So all of the MPs almost coalesced around this idea of co-benefits. This is what they could all agree on, is that the co-benefits of climate policies really need to be sold very strongly. So, you know, those co-benefits might be better air quality. I've mentioned lower costs for types of energy. Energy security was a very strong one, particularly with MPs who are perhaps not as convinced. They still felt they could make the energy security argument. Obviously, that's having that's being used to support fossil fuel extraction at the moment, but energy security for the UK is definitely a strong argument they felt they could use. Improved health through active travel and business opportunities for constituencies and as the nation as a whole also. Another common theme, or rather an interesting talking point that we found, was the way science is used in the narratives that MPs deploy. And there were a full range of arguments almost as to how science was the reason that we need faster and stronger action on climate change, but also the basis for taking a pragmatic and sensible approach. And that was set in contrast to, and this word was used, more hysterical or shrill calls for faster action. So science in some ways was, by some MPs, was conflated or wrapped into this idea of a rational argument, a logical argument, pragmatic approach, rather than the need for faster change, because that's almost not scientific. Obviously, that contrasts with what the science actually says about the need for a really rapid phase out of fossil fuels. And also, some MPs were less sure of the science and less certain. There was definitely a sense of uncertainty. Becky mentioned I get information from both sides, and uncertainty about where the science is solid and where it isn't solid in their mind. So we'll move on just to coming to the end of the presentation. We'll talk about, hopefully that slide will move to, what does this mean for NGOs? We've just been talking about science and the basis that science has, the foundation that science provides for MPs to make an argument, but also the vulnerabilities there. So there seems to be an opportunity to link this with the importance of local constituents and communication with constituents. And if, for instance, scientists within MPs' constituencies could build up a relationship with the MPs, perhaps an ongoing relationship where they can confirm, reassert what the science is saying as perhaps new reports come out or new analysis comes out, and just reinforce MPs' understanding of the science and why this does support ongoing rapid climate action. Similarly, constituents' voices are really important. We talked at length to the MPs about how they interact with their constituents and what arguments from constituents are convincing, what type of constituents are convincing. But by their own admissions, the MPs said that they hear a lot from the loudest voices at the ends of the spectrum, but not necessarily from the more silent majority. And we know there's some really interesting research by Steve Akehurst about the extent to which MPs' views of what their constituents think match actually what their constituents think and their attitudes. And particularly, there's a particularly stark case where MPs in some constituencies think their constituents are really against onshore wind, and that does not tally with constituents' support for onshore wind. Generally, constituents are much more supportive than the MPs think they are. So these kind of splits between the understanding of MPs and their constituents' wants and opinions on climate change, a bridge could be built between those two things, and perhaps there's an opportunity for NGOs just to provide regular information to MPs about that silent majority. Also, engaging the public more widely, there's a very kind of well-voiced view now that the public needs to be brought on board with climate change, and any links that can be made between MPs and their constituents will really help. Related to that, the social and distributional aspects. So in effect, who's going to pay, who's going to be the winners and losers of any new climate policies. We talked about ULEZ, we talked about congestion charge zones, cost of living crises, cost of energy. These are going to be the elements of climate policy which really perhaps make or break the success. And so paying a close attention to those distributional impacts. So rather than focusing on either the sort of moral case for climate change in a global sense, obviously that's really important, but on the ground, it's going to be who is affected. And if people are going to be negatively affected, that needs to be minimized, or they need to be compensated. And we see that playing out with, for instance, the ULEZ and the congestion charge zones. It's the arguments about who is losing out from this are perhaps the most powerful ones. So related to that, localized strategies are really important. The MPs are obviously very closely linked to their constituencies. All of them talked at length about what climate action in the UK meant for their constituencies and their local communities. So anything that NGOs can do to build that bridge, to provide evidence to MPs that their constituents support climate action, or allow them to make arguments, allow them to advocate for climate action on the basis of their constituents, will be really useful. Many of the MPs, when we were saying, what do you think about climate change in the UK at the moment, or climate politics, unprompted, many of them talked about the recent protests. So from Extinction Rebellion through Just Stop Oil, Insulate Britain. And while some of them said that this protest had been really useful to raise the salience of climate as an issue initially. Most of them said they thought it was too much now and it was actually potentially damaging to their case. Some of them said that explicitly. Even people who were even the MPs, most of whom were very pro-climate action, said they thought the protest was harming the case now because it meant that climate advocacy could be conflated with what could be seen as extreme people who are harming people going about their everyday lives. So obviously there's a debate around the role and the function and the impact of protest, but it's something to consider definitely going forward. And finally, just a final point, and this came out from several of the interviews. It was clear that lobbying and access to MPs is a really important thing to consider. So obviously we talked a lot about constituents and the mandate from constituents, and that's certainly how the MPs referred to their mandate. But MPs are exposed to lobbying and just having lots of meeting with other actors who have got an interest in this. So the exposing that and making that transparent, and then perhaps applying pressure so that constituents' views and the scientific case gets equal weight in MPs' thinking as these other powerful and perhaps more hidden lobbying interests are taking effect as well. So yeah, that's it as a quick run through of the findings of the report, and we'll be very looking forward to taking any questions, any feedback on the research. Becky, was there anything else you wanted to say just finally to wrap up, or should we go to Q&A?
No, let's dive in. Okay,
I'll stop sharing.
Brilliant. Thanks, Steve, and thanks, Becky. Really great to hear all the findings that you've presented. I'm going to encourage everybody listening to add your questions to the Q&A. We don't have any yet, which is possibly because people are frantically typing. Oh, we have one. So what I'm going to do is ask you my question, and then I'll get a chance to read as you answer, and then I'll put some of the participants' questions to you. My main question is really kind of to dig in a bit more to this question about how we get constituents effectively engaging with MPs. So the 2018 research was really important for the Climate Coalition in providing some of the insight and evidence as to why we need to get constituents to engage with MPs. And that finding at that time was that constituents weren't talking to MPs enough about climate change. They weren't hearing about it. It feels to me like the picture is a lot more complex now. So they are hearing, but then perhaps discounting certain voices as being kind of on the extremes or too loud. And how do we, as NGOs, get our supporters to be the most effective advocates with their MPs? Just be kind of interested in a bit more kind of your thoughts on that.
Should I start, and then
sure.
Steve, just shout if you want to come in. I'm sort of really relaxed about this, actually, Bronwyn. I think that it is. I genuinely think this is a numbers game. I think that still it's still rare that that constituents volunteer views on climate spontaneously on the doorstep or at constituency meetings. It's still, relatively small part of the post bag. I don't think we need to worry so much about the sort of specifics of the message. I just think that, if there are loads of people talking to their MPs about climate, full stop, that in itself will then have the effect of MPs becoming more engaged because they'll want to do that on behalf of their constituents. So, I mean, absolutely nothing wrong with sort of providing pointers, talking about co-benefits language, making it local, making it personal, that kind of thing. But I wouldn't worry about what they're saying as long as it's, I'm your constituent, I'm worried about climate change, I'm counting on you.
Yeah, can I come in there? Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think the MPs we talked about the type of communication they get. So many of them mentioned mass email campaigns and said that they do pay attention to them, but not so much. They respond, obviously, but they see that as a low cost thing for anybody to do. It's very easy to fire off a single email and respond to a campaign, so they don't pay a huge amount of attention to that. The individualized personal approaches are much more important. There was a definite, if possible, it might be useful, it's useful to look at how the individual MP tends to make their arguments. So there were definitely contrasts in some MPs suggesting that they are based on, I mean, I think most MPs want to make a logical, rational argument. And some of them said very specifically it has to be based on science, and we talked about that earlier. But there were other views expressed as well. So a couple of MPs were talking more about an emotional, justice-based reasoning for the types of campaigns they get involved in, or the types of advocacy they do. And so I think tailoring to a specific MP, if possible, is a very sensible thing to do. If the MP thinks they're a scientist and that's how they make their arguments, then approaches that emphasize the science and how the UK isn't doing enough compared to the science, for instance, would be have a lot of potential. If MPs are more into kind of social justice and a kind of an emotional, moral stance, then those arguments are going to play to their strengths, as it were. Yeah. So, and there's unfortunately the usual case about the usual suspects. Some MPs said, I hear only from a very small set of people, and it's the same people every time. And you can sense that they don't pay a huge amount of attention to those regular approaches if they feel it's just saying the same thing. So I'm sure this is a challenge for NGOs, but getting new people, even if, as Becky said, even if it's just a one-liner saying, I'm really concerned about climate change, I've never written to you before, it doesn't have to be an in-depth approach, but new people will carry weight.
Great, thanks very much. I'm going to kind of keep going on the question about how we talk about this. A couple of questions here about framing. So got a question from Rick about whether focusing on co-benefits is the right approach, or kind of messages about global leadership and climate impacts. And we had another question about whether we should frame in terms of fuel poverty or health impacts. So any kind of learnings on best ways to frame climate? I suppose that goes for kind of both constituents and MPs.
I mean, the debate about whether you lead on the co-benefit or lead on climate, that debate is as old as the hills. I think, I mean, the answer has to be both and. So with the previous pre-2018 research, we saw what I identified as stealth strategies, which is where MPs were pushing climate action without calling it climate action. So they were just doing things and calling it, air quality or health benefits or so on. I think that is fundamentally it defeats the object, because did then does more now, because we know that people are worried about climate. So I think the answer has to be a both and message. You can say that you're doing things because of climate, and also make a really positive case about why that's good in economic terms, in health terms, and so on. So I think it has to be both and, but I don't for a second think we should be editing our climate voices, or sort of playing down the climate reasons for doing stuff, because there's some other research my group has been doing has shown that people are really concerned about climate, and they are really worried about government's ability to grasp the nettle and do something. So the more that government, parliament, MPs can actually show they are willing to rise to the challenge is really important.
Just on Rick's first question, in terms of focus on co-benefits right for communicating with both elites and the wider public? And he says, or should we be pushing messages around global leadership, climate impacts, and future generations for the wider public? And only focusing on co-benefits for elites, as Steve Akers has argued, is interesting, because I read that and I almost thought it was the opposite, that co-benefits is the argument that is used for constituents. And certainly I think that's the approach taken by the politicians, is that to maintain public support, we have to use co-benefits and maybe have climate change. I think Labour's approach, I'm not sure if it's the same, was having climate change, if you're talking about policies, as the sort of the fourth one out of cost of living and health and climate change as well. That may have shifted a bit. But for instance, several of the MPs talked about global leadership and the UK leading, both in terms of setting an example and also developing new technologies. And that, for some MPs, that seems really important, that they can have this framing of the UK as a leader. Yeah.
Great. I want to move on slightly differently to the kind of role of constituents. Did you get anything through the kind of research about the role of media? So we've got a question about the role of local or national media in shaping how MPs respond. And also, I think social media probably comes in there as well. Another question about how should we be talking? You talked about lobbying, the importance of lobbying. Should we be calling out where we see like the negative voices and the disinformation, either in social media or in national media? Is that helpful?
Do you want to take that, Steve? I don't know how much media was raised.
Yeah, media wasn't raised a huge amount, but it was raised by a few MPs, and definitely as having a chilling effect on the extent to which they could strongly advocate. There were two specific references to the Daily Mail and to front pages. I think there were front pages, for instance, Ed Miliband had talked at an event about something around the idea of reparations in relation to climate change, and there was a Daily Mail front page, and so there's definitely a sense of caution or running scared of that section of the media, and so that definitely affects how they feel they can present climate policies. So yeah, I think it's quite an important underlying factor in how these things how climate policies are put forward. Sorry, can you remind me the second part of the question?
I've got a lot of questions, so I'm trying to bundle them together a bit. So there was a question about whether it is useful to sort of call out some of the disinformation and sort of negative reporting on, whether that's more on social media, but some in the national media as well.
In terms of, I think it depends, and you will probably have as much insight in terms of useful for MPs for it to be called out, or. I mean, I think the message is that, yeah, this seems to be a kind of hidden but powerful part of what might make up an MP's mandate. So calling it out, yes, potentially is useful. The mechanism by which that's done, I don't have particular insights in.
Thanks. I'll move on to the role of business voices, again, kind of connecting to that lobbying. A question from Kate about whether this sort of supportive business voices are better in public or in private. Any sense there, particularly with a lot of NGOs having good relationships with some of those supportive businesses, how can we support that voice?
Shall I take that? Do you want to take that, Becky?
Go on, Steve.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm not sure if we mentioned it in the presentation, that I think there's a real opportunity that you might have picked up, that if business lobbying in a positive sense, if in terms of climate action, could be really powerful, and definitely is really worth doing. And I think in private and in public, whichever seems appropriate. I think in private, that some of the MPs, talked about how change occurs and how coalitions are built, and those private conversations and building of relationships are really important to to facilitate ongoing change. So definitely, I think both, and in terms of if businesses are really happy to campaign publicly to put pressure on their MPs, that could be really good. If they're happy to have conversations behind the scenes, equally good, I think.
But just to link that back to the last question, Bronwyn, I think I agree business voice is really important. At the same time, I think that, we need to learn the lessons of Brexit, that the, pro-Remain sort of very business focused, very calm, evidence-based, trying to myth bust approach, has its downsides, should I say, and that, I think that I actually think that emotion and personal connections are really important in the climate space. I think people want things that feel right. I think the importance of good local stories. I'm a big fan of the local storytelling exchange, for example, which actually pulls out stories that come from people who themselves have decided to work for a net zero industry or that kind of thing. We can't make the argument on facts alone.
Yeah, agreed. And just to follow up, one of the MPs said explicitly that we have to build our arguments based on a rational, logical, scientifically founded arguments, but in fact those are quite boring, and it's emotional issues that really create social change. And so, and this ties into the protest element as well. Whilst I think MPs are almost obliged to say they don't support protests blocking roads because it affects some of their constituents, even if they're actually supportive of the cause and in private might say, yeah, we quite like it, that it's going on. So we obviously can't translate what the MPs are saying too literally into what NGOs should do or advocate for. I mean, obviously we wouldn't do that, but it's important to not take it all as too set in stone.
Bronwyn, there's a really interesting question about whether it's unhelpful to think in terms of a public mandate. Can I take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to pick that one.
Okay. I beat you to it. I mean, it's absolutely right to raise this. The Climate Change Act is law. We therefore have to meet it. Shouldn't we just get on with it? I think that the architecture of the Climate Change Act is brilliant in that it is long-term and, cross-party consensus and absolutely holds us to account. But we do not have strong enough awareness of how those targets can be met. So there's a big public engagement job to do there. Support for concern about climate change does not by any means automatically translate into support for climate action. And I mean, in my view, the Euler situation was entirely predictable in that, we saw it in the Gilets jaunes in France, and that opportunity, that potential for backlash, I think we should take really, really seriously. This government isn't helping by leaning into that backlash. And, I would want political leaders to, be much more upfront in their climate messaging. But we absolutely cannot do this through the back door just because it's a legal requirement. We can't take public support for granted. We've absolutely got to build up that case that, we must act on climate. Acting on climate is a partnership between people and government. Government can make it easier for us, we can make it easier for them, and we need to create that sense of a virtuous circle. So I think there is, that's why I do tend to use the term public mandate or social mandate, because that is an active conversation between people and state. And if we aren't very active and proactive about that conversation, we're not going to get anywhere.
Thanks. I wanted to, there's a question here about whether MPs had talked about global issues. So we've heard a lot about the importance of localising the conversation, but were you also hearing from any of the MPs you spoke to about the importance of global governance, the UN, how we address this as a global issue? Is that coming through in the conversation?
It didn't come through a lot, but I think that was mainly because that wasn't the focus of our questioning. It was very much on the UK climate mandate and the relationship with constituencies and the effectiveness of NGOs and that relationship too. So some of them did mention the importance of global cooperation. Lots of them mentioned the impacts globally and sort of justice elements as a reason that we should be doing it. But no, in terms of the frameworks, the political frameworks, we didn't go into that in any great depth.
Thanks. I think that's useful. I know certainly a lot of the members of the Climate Coalition have a global perspective, and I think it is a challenge for us to engage constituents and then MPs in those global questions, but obviously really central to the whole issue. So it's interesting if it's not one of the kind of key frames that's coming through for MPs.
I don't think so. I mean, for instance, I think when their constituents, one of the MPs represented a diverse constituency with different ethnic groups, and I think that is obviously a part of their thinking as well. So if there's a diaspora element to their constituency, then that was raised by one MP in particular, but it wasn't across the board. It wasn't a common topic that was discussed.
Okay, I'm going to jump to a question about the categories of MPs. So you've kind of come up with these little portraits of particular MPs, but we're obviously without talking about party affiliation. So the question here is the conclusion that there are more commonalities across different parties than we might think?
I'll jump in there. Yes, so there are doubtful voices in both major parties. I think, you know, it's pretty obvious that climate is more of a problem on the right than the left, but it is actually harder than you think to disentangle party affiliation. So we deliberately, you know, didn't present the MPs in terms of from political parties. And I don't know if can I segue into the question about fence sitting MPs, Bronwyn, because I think that's really connected. I think that, you know, we do see climate champions in both the main party, well, all of the main parties. But Isabel asked a question about should we focus on the sort of fence sitter MPs like Alan in our sample, who, you know, in public gives a pro-climate message but has a lot of private doubts. And I would say unequivocally yes. I've worked in my previous life. I did a lot of work trying to get MPs to dinners and briefings and that kind of thing, and just, you know, getting bums on seats with MPs is really hard. And so I can understand why there's a kind of an old faithful group of MPs that you can work with in Parliament, who do answer your emails, who do come to things, and they're absolutely useful, and, you know, they need to be supported and helped, and they play a role. But I think particularly now that climate is mainstream but contested, we need to do whatever we can to focus on those, you know, what you might call the fence sitters, or the ones that sort of know they should be saying stuff about climate and don't know what to say. And you know, and that is maybe we're sort of slightly stuck record about this, but the things that you can do with them in terms of their local role, by linking them up with, you know, local climate scientists at, you know, universities, who they probably have links to anyway, through linking to them through constituency groups, faith groups, anyone who isn't from a sort of climate branded organization, and I think if I was sort of doing NGO strategy now, that's what I would be really encouraging, sort of picking out those MPs, doing a bit of electoral maths, and working out how you can actually make sure they are getting climate messaging from people who they want to have on side.
Thanks. I think that's really useful. There's another kind of connected question about how we kind of apply the lessons here to candidates. So as we're coming into an election period, any advice on the sort of approach we should be taking with engaging with the candidates in an election, and how they, in this sort of heightened time, is there anything particular we should be looking to do differently or continue to do as we kind of approach an election?
I'll just do a bit of preamble for this, and then maybe Becky might have some insights as well. We found that the consensus across Parliament, some of the MPs, a new MP said they thought they found that surprising when they came into Parliament recently, how mainstream climate was and the lack of dissenting voices. And one of them, quite a young MP, kind of theorized that this was because of the new income of MPs, the new influx of MPs, who during the campaigns, climate had been much more of an important issue than it was for MPs who are longer standing. And so because their campaigning had been done with climate involved, they were much more pro-climate overtly than perhaps some MPs who are more long-standing MPs. So they thought that was more important than the age of candidates. So Becky, I don't know if you've got any ideas about new MPs coming in or prospective MPs.
I think this is when party leadership is really important, and I appreciate that NGOs have limited influence over that. But one thing that I worked with Green Alliance on around previous elections is bringing the candidates together to give them some sort of basic briefing on climate, and then really importantly bringing them together with someone very senior from their party to talk about that party's approach to climate, and that is really effective, because if they are, as candidates, being told that this is something the party's actively thinking about, and that's part of the job of being a candidate, then that is really, really useful, because MPs coming into Parliament will be their sort of balancing act will be, right, these are the issues that I care about, this is what's coming through from the constituency, and this is what my party want me to do. And ideally we would like climate to be part of sort of all three of those influences. And the danger is that if they're not getting it from constituents, and if they're not getting it from party leadership, then even if their own views are, even if they are privately concerned, it won't be something they choose to speak out on.
I just wanted to come in on what I mentioned just during the presentation, but one of the MPs said that they thought climate change was the top issue for constituents, and then they said, the long-term underlying top issue. And I think that really captures how climate can be viewed in some sense. It's this ongoing issue that may not be the top issue all the time, but it's always there. And so I don't know, informing and just educating the incoming or potential MPs as to where constituents generally are at, where the public opinion is generally, and how people will probably appreciate climate being mentioned in the mix of other policies, even if it's not necessarily the number one campaigning issue. And
a connected question in terms of the kind of what we're seeing now as we approach the election is about the sort of messaging. So we've got a question from Lexi that current political leaders seem to think that the public want to hear that we're only responsible for 1% of emissions, we shouldn't beat ourselves up about doing more, and anything we can do to kind of avoid a populist race to the bottom based on that sort of messaging.
So on that, this is as much about people's trust in government and faith in government is about climate. So, you know, people do not have fixed preferences and views. It's very shapeable. That's what politics is about, right? Trying to can tell to build a narrative that resonates with people. And I mentioned before some work that we're doing with groups of people, of public groupings. They are not convinced that government has what it takes to lead on climate. And so if people take that position, then if a government, as I think this government is doing now, sort of leans in on that and says, as the question says, yes, we're a small part of emissions, we should do stuff, but let's not go too quick and so on, then that is self-reinforcing. The flip side of that is that if you have political leaders, and this doesn't have to be party leadership, if you have political leaders, respected MPs saying, we need to do stuff about climate change, we absolutely can, this is the story of transformation, then that also can be very popular. And then the benefit is that then chimes with the latent concern that we know people have, very high levels of concern. So if you get that sort of virtuous circle, then there's every opportunity to turn that around. There is cynical electioneering to be done in pandering to those more cynical voices, yes, and that is the danger.
Yeah, just agreed. All the polling shows that the public, over a long time, not just the polling, but loads and loads and loads of research just shows that the public realise that the government has to lead on this, and they want clear leadership, and winding back on clear leadership is, obviously it remains to be seen what happens in the election, but it's not what people say they want. So I think just emphasising that people want clear, strong leadership from government on climate change.
Great. We are coming up to the end of our time today. Apologies to anyone whose question has not been answered. I wanted to give Becky and Steve just any final thoughts in 30 seconds or so each, or anything that you wanted to pick up that we haven't touched on, sort of just to wrap us up, really. Which of you would like to go first there?
I think one point that I want to leave us with is this gap between MPs' perceptions of their constituents and constituents' own views. And there's been more comments in the chat about MPs using constituents' views as an excuse for inaction. I think that doing that actually it actually is not taking those views in good faith. I think there is a lot of support for a lot of concern about climate and a lot of support for action. It's there for the taking, but it does need some clever political crafting and some good narrative to make that happen. And that's my sort of number one message to the Labour Party, for example, that that it is there for the taking. And I think that the more that we can do collectively to bridge that gap between MPs' perceptions of people's views and people's actual views, the better.
Yeah, I agree with that. And just in terms of what's really came out strongly was this, the fracturing occurs around ideas of the just transition or justice and distribution impacts. We didn't use the word justice because it can be, kind of provocative for certain political positions, but that real attention needs to be paid there if there is going to be ongoing support. And that may pose some tricky questions in terms of, if costs don't fall on people who are less well off, where do the costs fall? I think those conversations need to be had honestly, and perhaps there's a little bit of a silence over that at the moment.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much. It's been really, really good conversation. I'm sure everyone will be taking away a lot of food for thought. Would encourage you all to read the report itself. There's a lot in there, and we'll certainly be using it at the Climate Coalition for our kind of strategy going forward. So thank you to Becky and Steve, and thanks to Green Alliance for hosting, and thanks for everyone for joining, all your brilliant questions.